today, this afternoon, we have with us Kathleen Lahey. She's a professor and Queen's National Scholar at Queen's University, and she's at the Faculty of Law, Gender Studies, as well as graduate program in Cultural Studies. She specializes in all aspects of tax law and policy, comparative fiscal studies, equality law, and queer law. And she recently published a book entitled Taking Back the Budget, Feminist Institutional, Gender-Based, and Gender Budget Analysis. And in the wake of the recent income splitting plans, you might want to check out her more recent public writing as well. So Kathleen is presenting the plenary this afternoon entitled How Alberta's Tax and Budget Policies Undermine Women's Equality. Yes, there are other alternatives. So welcome, Kathleen.
Thank you. It is really wonderful to be here today, to be at this conference with you, people from Alberta, because to a certain extent, I think it's fair to say that Alberta tax politics lie at the heart of some very big changes and therefore some very big issues that are shaping up not just for people who live in Alberta, but for people who live everywhere in Canada, everywhere in North America, and to be fair, really almost the whole world, because of the developments that I'm going to be outlining in this talk. I want to start, however, not with the here in Alberta, but with some basic observations on the nature of taxation from the point of view of human relationships and society. The first point that I'd like to make is that, I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but taxes are probably one of the oldest forms of political and social expression that communities have developed. There is evidence that dates back to the year 2350, before the Common Era, nearly 4,400 years ago, making it clear that states were already very actively involved in taxing and in discussing tax policy to the extent that conversations like that could be held on what was often a battlefield. The second point that I'd like to make is that, in fact, taxes are so old and so ingrained in human forms of relating to each other that I think it's fair to say that taxes themselves are constitutive of the possibility of having something that we now today would call a state. And at the same time that taxes constitute the possibility of having a state, they also play a very significant role in defining who matters in the state and who gets what, under what conditions, and from whom. The third thing that I'd like to say about the general nature of taxes is that taxes are an expression of the fundamental need of human beings to connect with each other, to form social relationships, to define and manage communities on a sustainable basis, and to give expression to the deep intellectual understanding that humans have developed as they've learned to live with their material surroundings. And the last point that I'd like to make, and probably the most important, is that challenging though it may be, disappointing as it is sometimes to many of us, the political rhetoric of tax abuse, tax fairness, and tax cuts has literally been with human beings from the dawn of any discernible history. And I'll just direct you to a set of quotations from a funerary song or a praise song that was composed in honor of Urukagina, who promised 4,364 years ago to, when he became king, abolish abusive forms of tax collection that had existed since time immemorial, to clear and cancel those living as debtors because of grain taxes, and would never subject the waif and the widow to the whims of the powerful. Such was the importance of tax rhetoric at that time in gaining the confidence of the community that even so long ago, at the dawn of history, people were talking about how they were going to produce and manage a better, fairer, more effective tax system than those who had gone before. The only problem is that as human beings, we seem to be challenged when it comes to our learning curves, because there are a lot of problems that emerge in the tax context that just keep coming back. But before I go into the details of the types of tax challenges that we face today, I'd like to touch on another really important aspect of history, and that really relates to why my talk focuses on how Alberta's tax and budget policies undermine women's equality and why it's necessary to look for alternatives. And the reason for that is that even older than the notion of taxes, as an expression of the types of relationships that constitute the state and constitute citizenship, is the very important fact that literally from the dawn of recorded history, women have never been the citizens who are constituted by the fact that taxes help create and finance a state. So to talk about women tax citizenship is still, in the year 2014, something of a misnomer. Why is that? Because Roman citizens did not all sit around engaging in academic discussions, enjoying leisure, and participating in the intellectual life while the commodified laborers were out doing the uninspiring work. No, those people were all men. And mostly they did not do that at home with their daughters, their wives, their female slaves, their mothers. They did it in the forum with each other. And they could only enter the forum if they were citizens. Women, by definition in Roman law, could not be citizens. They were juridically stripped, shorn of every juridical characteristic of legal personality or citizenship under Roman law for hundreds of years under a system of rules that became more rigid, not less. As a consequence, women existed as literally non-persons in ways that men did not. True, young men existed as non-persons until they became citizens, which was largely a function of their maturation through the mores of Roman society. But Roman civil law, which was spread all across Europe, all across the UK, and has been transported through both European, continental European and English colonial legal systems, has remained the starting point for defining the concept of citizenship from day one. And the only counter-discourse that has ever challenged that lack of citizenship, including fiscal citizenship, has been customary legal traditions that have approached issues of gender, state, constitution, empowerment, and so on from a different perspective. Christian doctrine has become implicated in this process because at a certain point in the Roman development of Roman law, it became quite clearly set out that the only person who could exercise legal capabilities to do things like own property, enter into contracts, decide to consent to marriage, and so on, would be the oldest male in the household. And the concept of the joint undivided family grew out of that, in which the legal personality and literally the power of life or death in some situations existed by one individual over every other person in the household, right? Now, I say that religion became involved in this conceptualization of why it was that women just didn't have any legal powers and also did not count from a fiscal perspective, because I vaguely recall from my own brushes with religion that the notion of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost was the same sort of conceptual merger of multiple beings into one entity where the power was held by, in the case of Roman law, patria potestas, that is, the father of the fathers. This system of law did not start to come apart until the year 1821. So we're talking about most of human experience has conceptualized gender relations through this particular perspective. And in the Canadian context, because Canada inherited this juridical approach to women's lack of any legal capabilities through both its civil law tradition in the French colonial period and the Anglo legal tradition during the English colonial period, we have lived in a system in which every juridical right, every civil right that female persons have has had to be affirmatively won and agreed by the government to be put into the laws, the constitutions, and the international treaties from which basic rights, such as the right to decide to work for wages, could be carried out. Now, it's very interesting that, as you probably know, the period between, say, the 1880s and the 1920s was a very active one in terms of the women's movement. The married women's property legislation model developed extensively during that period of time, and probably more through accident of history rather than from deliberate intention, when Canada's Income War Tax Act was enacted in 1917 to finance the cost of going into World War I. And when the United States Internal Revenue Code was enacted in 1918 for much the same purpose, instead of putting the English concept of the only taxpayer being the husband who would report his wife's earnings as if they were his own, both the Canadian and the US tax systems passed laws that treated individuals as the taxpayer. Didn't say that they had to be men or women, didn't say who these individuals were, but it was very clear that it was not just the husband. Now, from the moment that those laws hit the statute books, social conservatives have been pushing back as hard as they can. If you go to the Hansard during that period of time, you'll find the debates filled with references about the unsightly view of a spinster not having to pay as many taxes as a husband, or problems like that. There were aspersions cast on men who did not marry because they were not actually supporting a household and doing their job for king and country by having additional children, etc. So this is the background from which we approach the concept of gender and taxation, because women in Alberta have lived in very close proximity to the difficulties that have been put in the way of women who would have their full juridical rights, their full civil rights, and their full constitutional rights. And I'm referring, first of all, to the fact that the famous five who went to the British Privy Council to get a decision overturning the first decision on the issue of the young Supreme Court of Canada were from or lived in Alberta and were motivated by their own experience of having acted as fully capably and effectively as the men in their domains. And so they went to the British Privy Council and obtained a very important ruling which planted what is called a living tree of interpretation in the Constitution of Canada that says that in the context in which a colonial constitution was planted in a new jurisdiction, there lay the facts against which the meaning of terms in the Constitution should be interpreted. And so the British Privy Council held that women could be persons for purposes of sitting in the Senate. And everything else is sort of history, except that from that decision in 1929, it took until 1982 to actually get it written down in the Canadian Constitution. But it's in there now in sections 28 and section 34 of the Constitution Act. And section 15, with its equality rights, puts a very clear sort of backstop to that basic proposition. So what I can say then, to make the record very accurate, is that probably women have been almost full citizens since 1982 in Canada. But let's now go back to the fiscal context, because, as I said, from 1918 in the US and 1917 in Canada, legislators and parliamentarians had been working as hard as they could to get a reversion back to the joint undivided family, in which all income would be considered to belong to the husband, and wives would be seen as a sort of domestic appliance, the costs of which would be subsidized by the state by giving them some tax subsidies or tax benefits to help maintain them, pay the costs of their keep, their food, and so on. Okay, so those are two historical factors that I think really frame this entire discussion. And the point that I'd like to turn to now is that while women were working so hard to get equal rights and to get on the road to fiscal citizenship, there was a rearguard action taking place in the form of recognition of the personhood, the juridical powers of a natural person of corporations, which was done thanks to English courts in 1896 in an important case called Solomon and Solomon, in which the court decided that a corporation formed by human beings could have all the powers of a juridical person, except it has been held not the power to marry or to have children. By creating these alter egos, who were very conveniently under the contractual control of their creators, a really nice substitute was found for the loss, as it turned out, of the joint undivided family. Because corporations have turned out to be one of the most flexible tools known to humanity for the collection of capital assets, for the sequestration of income, the division of expenses from profits, to becoming easily transportable, amenable to what the board of directors tells it to, and to top it off, the courts have been realistic about this. They've decided that corporations don't really have to have the same kind of conscience, the same sort of moral structure, the same kind of ethical framework that human beings have. So they're like really an improvement on the old model of the joint undivided family. So having set the stage in this way, what I'd like to do now is to turn to how all of this relates in a number of structural and concrete ways to the whole process of getting to where we are today, which is in states all around the country, or the United States, provinces all across Canada, and countries all around the world that have gone on a mad dash into the most tax-cutting mentality that they can generate, which is causing real problems for people everywhere. And so to turn to the first slide that I prepared for this presentation, I have here an image of some work that was done by some tax economists. Piketty was involved in this work, Sayez, and in Canada, Veal. This is a set of images that show the relationship between levels of taxation and concentration of wealth. Because once corporations were put into place as the sort of perfect conveyors and storage places for capital accumulations, and as soon as a number of sort of joint tax measures began to creep in the back door in the personal income tax system, the search was on the part of wealth holders for ways in which to accumulate their wealth at as fast a pace as possible. The set of lines on the top shows the concentration of wealth in the very top echelon of the economy, the top 0.1% of the 0.01% of the population. And what it shows is that after the sort of glorious heyday of the Gilded Age, during which capital accumulation was at a very high level and there were lots of very poor people as a consequence in the income distribution, the enactment of the Income War Tax Act with its progressive rate structures, along with similar enactments in other countries, produced a situation in which the concentration of wealth really fell down to much more egalitarian levels. So the lower that top curve goes, the more fairly income is distributed among people in the population. And you can see how high tax rates drive that. The bottom panel, the second line there, shows the marginal rates for tax systems that were in place. And so what you see is that the higher the taxes in Canada got, the more fairly income was distributed amongst everybody who was in the population. But at the end of World War II, everybody felt that they needed a break from war, from conflict, families from separation from each other, governments from having to extract high levels of taxes from unwilling taxpayers, and so on. And so the move to begin cutting taxes began. It was in fits and starts, but as you can see, as this line moves from left to right on the bottom panel, the level of concentration of income in the hands of the richest began to go up, and it began to go up really almost lockstep as this period of time played out. Now, in the 1970s, it is fair to say, as illustrated by the next slide, that as Canada and other highly developed countries, these are all OECD countries, began looking around the world and trying to decide what they were going to do, there was a period of what I would call fiscal expansion, in the sense that tax systems continued to grow, tax rates continued to go up. This continued, and this first slide here that's up here shows that between 1965 and 1975, Canada was right in with all the other countries that were still growing their tax systems, raising more revenues, spending more in public infrastructure, education, transportation, healthcare, hospitals, schools, you name it. The investments were being made. But going through this series of slides, going to the next one, 1975 through 1985, you see the same set of highly developed countries, OECD countries, becoming a little less expansive. In fact, a few countries, the ones that the little bar is sticking out to my right, your left, were actually beginning to cut their total tax system and cut their revenue base. And this process continued on. The next slide shows that the number of countries cutting their total tax system began to grow in number. And this is when Canada stopped being in the top group and moved down into the bottom group. This takes us up to 1995. And this is an important period of time because this is the point at which the conversation about sex equality got a lot more serious than it had been even in the 1980s with the enactment of the Beijing Platform for Action for implementing a large number of sex equality promoting initiatives on the part of countries. And during this same period of time, this slide, the next slide, shows 1995 through 2007. You can see that the number of countries cutting taxes, cutting their total tax load, is growing. The size of the cuts is growing. And if you go on into the following slide, you see that this trend continued. This takes you up to 2009. And the final one in this series, which is the blue one, shows how slimmed down the tax systems in all of the OECD countries here are looking at the end of this period. This is the period of massive tax cuts that has unfolded really since the mid-1990s. And in the Canadian context, it's relevant because it's very hard to read this slide, but Canada is the third from the bottom in this slide. Tax cutter in the highly industrialized rich country category. The country with the biggest cuts is the Slovak Republic. And Canada tied really for second worst with Hungary. Okay, so that's what the picture looked like at the end of 2011. And during that period of time, from 1995 through to 2011, Canada had actually shrunk its entire national, provincial, and municipal tax bases by a magnitude of 1/8. It had cut 5.5% of its GDP out of its tax base. In 2011, that came to a total of $100 billion of revenue that was not collected in 2011. And every year since then, of course, that $100 billion has gotten even larger as time has gone by because the realities of sort of changes in consumer prices and so on has seen to that process. Now, I want to sort of stop at this point and just sort of ponder what it means in a country like Canada to cut out such a large chunk of revenue from every level of government. What does it do? And the next slide I put up is important because at this point, the point at which this massive set of tax cuts beginning in 1995 and running through 2011 came into effect, Canada had actually achieved something that I think caught a lot of people by surprise. It was consistently ranked by the United Nations as #1 in human development, #1 in the world, and ranked #1 in terms of gender equality in the world. That is, even though Canada had joined the tax cut parade fairly early on, still by 1995, it had a sturdy enough set of fiscal priorities that it had managed to give Canadians the best chance at human development that they could have in any country in the world. And at that point, Canada was very rich. It was rich in terms of what was in its treasury, and it was rich in terms of what it was able to give to people to turn into human capital, to turn into human potential, infrastructure investments, and so on. And one of the things that had helped get Canada to that point was that the roadmap for sex equality that had been agreed upon over and over again in important Law Reform Commission reports, constitutional documents, and international documents stipulated very clearly that to genuinely achieve gender equality, not only would women have to have equality of opportunity, but all practical obstacles to women earning their own incomes had to be removed, And all of the costs of physical and social reproduction, including the costs of having children, raising them, caring for households, and so on, should be shared between men and women, but among all members of society. And that any measures needed that were of special characteristics to achieve that had to be implemented for that purpose. This formula worked. As shown by the next slide, Canada was ranked number 1 for 1995, 1996, 1997, and 1998. But, as the slide that you're looking at now shows, it was during those years that the big 5.5% tax cut, 5.5% of GDP tax cut began to take shape in 1995. The string of yellow circles going in a downward line here in this slide, that's the shrinkage of Canada's treasury. And as you can see from both the red line, the blue line, and the green line, human development in Canada started to deteriorate right along with the fall in revenues. The red line is human development. That's everybody, all men, all women, all children, everybody lumped together. That did not stay number 1, but it stayed higher than the blue lines and the green lines. The blue line is the UN gender equality indicators. The blue line is kind of hard to look at. It jumps all over the place, but mostly you can see it's just gone down, down, down. That measures the deterioration of gender equality in Canada today. The green line is the World Economic Forum's view of matters, and it's even grimmer. I had to laugh a couple of days in the newspaper. There was a big headline in one of the national newspapers saying, "Good news, Canada surges ahead in gender equality." It had moved from number 20 in the World Economic Forum index to number 19. So, now to the down and dirty. How does this happen? What is going on? What does sex inequality look like? Everyone here probably came to this talk of their own free will. We're all adults here. How could this happen? Well, one of the realities, and the next slide shows this, is that in 2012, women continue to live in a really very separate economy compared to men. The lower line is women's average incomes ranging from age 16 all the way up to age 90. The bottom line on this chart is the age line. Going up the vertical axis is incomes. The top line, the one that goes way up, that's men's incomes by age. Used to be that at least 15 and 16-year-old women made more money than men because they could babysit and get more money for that than for mowing lawns. No longer. There is no year in a woman's life in Canada anymore in which she, on average, statistically, can tell herself, well, at least right now I'm making more money on average than men, or that I'm equal. There's very few years in which that can take place. If you look at the shape of the bottom line here, the bottom curve on this graph, you can see also that women have short peak earning years in life. Basically, women's peak earning years end in their mid-40s. And women's peak earning years take them to average incomes that are no higher than the average incomes earned by men when they're already in their late 20s. In contrast, men's incomes rise more rapidly, stay more durably at higher levels, their peak earning years are more numerous, their average incomes are higher, and even when they're in retirement, their average incomes in retirement years on retirement pensions, which are usually much more limited than ongoing peak earning year profiles, remain higher than women's incomes at all but their peak. There are two separate economies going on here, right? And that's a very big piece of what it means to have a gendered economy from a fiscal perspective. Going into the next slide, to just give you another view of this, anyone who is racialized or who is indigenous, a First Nations, an Inuit, a Métis person, is going to face an even bigger income gap, but it can be deceptive because to the extent that racism is alive and well in Canada, it is very true that there is suppression of male wages for people from racialized groups and from indigenous groups. And so it may look as if some women from racialized groups actually are earning a higher amount of income as measured by men's incomes, but in fact what you're looking at is the suppression of the male comparator wage with the consequent reduction in the wage gap that you see when you look at how men and women of the same groups compare with each other. Another view of what it means to be unequal in Canada today, and these are all tied directly to the fiscal system, which I will demonstrate to some extent, depending on how much time I have to do that. The next slide shows how this turns out, or how this plays out in terms of the efforts that women make in order to have some degree of financial autonomy. It's well known that Canadian women are amongst the most well-educated in the world because women in Canada have pursued further and higher education to levels that are simply not matched anywhere else. And women who have attained those educational levels have shown great dedication to entering into paid work and have taken advantage of the opportunity to earn their own incomes. And this slide shows that on every one of the educational levels that has been attained by women, we are now back at either pre-2000 average levels for full-time, full-year earnings, or worse. I'm going to move ahead because I would like to now turn to the way in which the tax system actually, I guess I can't move ahead that fast because you have to look at this slide, the next slide, entitled Women's Shares of Market Incomes versus Shares of Total Work Hours. This is the crux of the problem. The elimination of the big gap between the unpaid work that women do and the paid work that women do still has not equalized. And so while women are highly represented in the paid labor force, they are also very heavily responsible for unpaid work in ways that simply have not changed over the last 20 years. And this is a sort of a summary of the factors that sort of pin women into a situation not gain higher incomes on average. So they have high levels of work. They have high levels of paid work, but they only have a little bit more than 1/3 of all market incomes. Okay, so now I'm going to move ahead on some of these slides to take us into how this plays out in the tax system. And so I'm looking at a slide called Taxation and the Status of Women. The basic problem is that tax laws reflect and magnify women's long-standing economic disadvantages, and it happens in this way. In the next slide, you see a series of figures that reflect how the tax cuts that Canada has made over the last 2 decades have actually been framed and presented. And the first category I call structural detaxation, which is when governments have gone in and they have cut the high levels of personal income tax rates and corporate income tax rates down. Alberta is the extreme case with its 10% flat rate tax rate for personal income taxes and for corporations. And structural detaxation takes the form also of cuts to goods and services taxes, which is not relevant except federally in the Alberta context. the annual cost of just this one set of cuts in Canada for 2012 came to a total of $40 billion, just from those types of tax cuts, which have been done federally and have been done provincially on a consistent basis over the years. But this actually looks small and reasonable compared to the second category of tax cuts that have gotten completely and totally out of control in Canada specifically. And that is the tax expenditures, which come to a total of $172 billion per year in using 2010 figures. Tax expenditures are all the fine print that you see in tax laws. They are the dependent spouse exemption. They are the child tax credit. They are the stock option exemption, the partial exemption for capital gains, the dividend tax credit. They are the transfers that parents can take for paying their children's tuition and book fees when they go to university. There are hundreds and thousands of these tax expenditures in every tax statute in Canada. And would you be surprised to know that after all the tax expenditures were subtracted out of total personal income tax, corporate GST tax revenues, all Canada had left at the end of that in 2010 was $191 billion. That is almost half of Canada's remaining fiscal capacity is given away through these little, some people call them tax termites, that crawl through the tax system and create tax reductions everywhere, to the point where whole sections of the statute should come crashing down, except that it's become almost impossible to read them. That represents an additional $172 billion of revenue that is lost. Now start doing a little bit of mental math here. $172 billion a year for tax expenditures, gone into private hands. $40 billion a year from cutting the rates for the basic tax systems. We're already up nearly $220 billion. The $100 billion that was lost with the 5.5% dashed at the bottom, it's actually much bigger than that, isn't it? And if you include offshore tax haven, tax corporate gains, unreported incomes, Canada is not collecting over $250 billion of revenue every year. And every one of these uncollected tax dollars has a tax, has a specific gender footprint. And I'll just illustrate this by going down 2 more slides to the structural detaxation costs by sex in Canada in 2012. Who got the money, right? This is money that's privatized. The government no longer wants it, wants private citizens to take responsibility for it. It's their private property. It's ideologically correct to leave it where it was earned, right? Who gets it? Well, women's shares never rise much above 40%. So every one of these de-taxed dollars is actually enriching the private sector at a ratio of roughly 60 to 40% in favor of men. Women are never going to get to 50% on that math, right? Now, the last thing that I will take a look at, because it is of a great deal of sort of topical interest, is if you're tracking this, the tax benefits and transfers for unpaid partner work versus paid caregiving. This is income splitting. This is joint taxation. And this slide is overcrowded, it's messy, I can't let go of it. Shows that Canada spends, and this is just the federal government here, every year, something like $20 billion to subsidize those poor husbands who have to support all those women who do all that unpaid work in the household. And it's a sliding scale deal. Okay, sometimes it's a woman who is actually supporting the husband. But if we had time, we'd talk about how many hours of unpaid work are done by gender in that situation. You would perhaps be shocked. The bottom line here is that Canada is still spending, despite its massive tax-cutting history, $20 billion a year to subsidize the performance of unpaid work in the household. It is a purely ideological choice because reigning governments seem to believe that women's unpaid work is necessary to provide as a resource for households so that people will not have to use paid childcare, and so that everyone's lives can go along pretty much the way they've always gone on in post-colonial Canada. The only item on this chart, or on this slide here, that deviates from that script of subsidizing unpaid work in the household is the expenditure for childcare expenses. The childcare expense deduction, now with the top-up that was announced on October 30th, it's going to produce $1.6 billion per year. That's less than 7% of this total $23 billion that's being spent on the family sector, right? And nested inside this is the most recent in the long line of income splitting bills that the current government is so happy with. And I'm going to go down, and this will be my final slide, okay? Distribution of $2.7 billion, cost of parental income splitting tax benefits, Canada 2015, that's next year, okay? This slide shows that in that $23 billion, $2.7 billion may go as low as 2.3 with the October 30th packaging that has now been announced, is going to be spent to give a tax benefit to families that have 2 adults, 2 parents, and who have a big enough difference in their incomes that they can take advantage of this income splitting technique. It's a form of joint taxation. And as you can see, only a relatively small amount of this massive expenditure, and Canada is still technically, by the way, in a deficit position, so what's it doing spending this money? I thought we were living under austerity conditions. Very little of this money goes to the people who actually need the money. Who needs childcare? The richest people? No. The people who need childcare are the single parents who don't have another parent to juggle things on and off with, the 2-parent couples who are households who have heavy work schedules and don't have anybody that they can bring in to do unpaid work, but who cannot earn enough to pay for the childcare that they need, or the people who are receiving, for example, the Canada Child Tax Benefit, and who would like to go into paid work in order to augment their budget and make things better for their kids. They're getting virtually nothing. And over on the extreme right for you, you see that the gender distribution of this is really skewed as well. And the reason for this is that there are still relatively very few high-income earning women who are earning enough income to both have children and be able to support a spouse and get, therefore, a tax benefit under this income splitting scheme. 12% of women will get these benefits. The other 88% will go to men, more privatization of what would have been public revenues. Stepping back from the whole thing, there's been a lot of talk about, well, what would it cost to have an affordable childcare system in Canada? I've heard that it can be done for $11 billion per year. Canada is spending twice that much on unpaid work subsidies in the home. This is affordable. Even if nobody wants to raise any taxes, these tax benefits could be reframed. Anyway, there's lots more where this comes from, but as you can see, with a picture like this, how can you possibly say that women are now full fiscal citizens? I don't think that you can. I would like to end with my final slide before the blank. I'd like to end by saying, this International Women's Day, don't give us bread and roses. We know about the West African flower industry, the corporations, and all of the tax games that go on there. Give us bread and taxes. Thank you.
That's fantastic.
I'm sorry I didn't go by your 5-minute thing.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. That was a fascinating analysis of the connection between tax policies and gender inequality. And it is so heartening to think that women became full person or nearly full personhood in about 1982 in Canada. So
yes, yes.
Yes.
On the road.
Yay for that. And in my anxiety about the delay when we started, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Meenal Srivastav. I'm an associate professor of political economy and global studies at Athabasca University. After this wonderful presentation, I'm sure you have a lot of questions and comments. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, so we will have to keep it a little bit contained. We have about, I'm sure we can steal a few minutes from our tea break. We will take a couple of questions and then continue the conversation. So we have some mic runners?
There's someone in the front row there.
Right. One person over here. Did you raise your hand? No, I haven't. Oh, sorry. Oh. Would you like to raise your hand for questions or comments? Okay, you did. Okay.
I have one rhetorical question. Could it be with this? I have one rhetorical question. Could it be with this tax restructuring with the reigning government that they are buying votes? Amen.
I was just sort of curious about the dynamics around the class composition of the women who were supporting men in the slide that you showed. If you went back and you showed that it was like 12% of women who were in the position of basically being in the reverse role. And I was just sort of curious about that class composition and what sort of figures, what were the specific sort of dynamics in Canada that allowed for such a, what I would consider to be a large percentage of women to be in that category, that 12.3%. What are those occupations that they're doing, and et cetera, that form that?
Any other questions? No, I don't see any hands. Oh, sorry, there is one hand. Down here.
I'm sitting here in total amazement because your facts are so clear and convincing. And I was wondering, is anybody in Canada listening to you? Have you been asked to be speaking to any Senate committee or any of those other people who are screaming and hollering in Parliament that are doing the best job for Canadians? I mean the Conservatives. I am totally impressed with your very rational and calm presentation of totally alarming facts. Thank you.
Do you want to respond?
Okay, I can't resist answering that question first, but the question you ask is very serious, and I agree with the comment made initially. Yes, for a decade I've been making detailed sworn testimonial presentations to the parliamentary committees, the House Committee on Finance, the Senate Committee on Finance. I submit briefs every year. This material is very well documented. I just got back from a meeting of the UN in Geneva and presented this material to the UN Committee on the Status of Women. I'm not alone. There are many, many women who are saying the same things. The literature is growing. The winds of change are beginning to build. And now what's needed is for a serious effort to be made on the part of citizens, full citizens, to speak up and to take the time and trouble. I'm a little bit of a tax addict, so it's easy for me, but it's time for everybody to start understanding how this works, because our futures and our children's futures and the planet's future all depend on this. I've done gender training for all of the people who sit on the Status of Women Committee in the federal parliament. I meet with people in various parties. I meet with provincial officials. I've sat on tax advisory boards for a long time. I've done everything that I can do. There are a lot of people out there who want to talk about this. It's absolutely accessible information. So thank you very much for making that point. Who are these women? Your motives are pure in asking, right? Yeah, and the problem with that is that women's incomes are so low that 40% of all women do not ever have any tax liability. So how are they going to take advantage of a tax cut? How are they going to take advantage of a tax deduction? You can't. And by the way, that's how most of these boutique tax cuts work, right? You hand somebody a box of air, what are you giving them? Nothing, but it looks good on the outside and it looks good in those boutique tax credit ads on TV where people walk through the tax boutique and they pull down, you know, the caregiver credit, the volunteer firefighter credit. They pick up a small business credit. If they don't have any tax liability, they might as well just be batting flies. So who are these women? Well, some of them are women who have somewhat sustainable incomes, but who have partners who may not be able to work for a whole variety of reasons. They might be a student, they might be dealing with personal limitations, they may have made a contract that they were going to do it in that way. But a growing number of women have been able to earn enough income so that these are tax cuts that are available to them. But on average, the amount of money that each woman in that situation will get will be much smaller than her male cohort. That is, a male with the same age, same education, same income earning potential. She's not going to get as big a tax credit. So the whole system is, you know, excuse me for saying so, but it does look like it is designed to only be available to people at the very top of the income curve, and those are by definition men. And some of you may have noticed in the October 30th packaging or repackaging of this particular tax offering that the government has decided that it's going to make this fairer by putting a $2,000 cap on the maximum amount that anybody can claim in relation to the income splitting. Thank you. And if you look at this gray column here, well, what difference is that going to make? That's just like that empty box full of nothing but air, right? I wouldn't even dignify it by saying that it's hot air. It's just not going to make any difference. Now, you may be wondering about sort of what's the backstory of this. A lot of this is the handiwork of the Reform Party, the Alliance Party. We're back to Alberta here. A lot of this is the work of the Focus on the Family group in the United States, which became very worried that Obama was going to repeal income splitting in the United States in the 2000 election. They mobilized and had been mobilizing Focus on the Family Canada. And between the two Focus on the Family groups, the Institute for Marriage and the Family in the United States started doing a lot of work on the importance of joint taxation to maintaining a Christian home. Why? Well, because first of all, women who are not out engaging in paid work are more likely to be open to the possibility of having additional children. very important to some people. And this line of analysis, as a tax policy proposition, was imported into Canada through the Institute on Marriage and the Family Canada, which is funded by Focus on the Family Canada. The chief executive officer of whom used to be Mr. Harper's prime political or policy advisor, David Quist. So we have a very well-known sector of Alberta society busily at work, trying to make this a reality for everyone. Not because it's fairer, not because it's going to make Canada a better place, not because it's going to make sure that kids have something to eat before they go to school. It's being done for purposes that are designed to make it harder for women to feel like they want to venture out into the world and get a divorce, make it easier for men to be able to think that they're going to be able to support a family if they do get married. It's basically being done as a marriage promotion project.
So, here,
well, I didn't think of it.
yeah. You have another example of the Albertaization of Canada in all of this. And I don't know, do you have any other questions or comments? We can probably take one or two more questions if there is one. There's one question here and one. Why don't we take one here and then one right in the back? Sorry.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. And I have to tell you that the hair on the back of my neck is standing up because now my anger is stoked once again. Certainly, you can't split an income if you're a single parent family, whether it's male or female, so you get none of that.
Right.
And it's purely a comment that I'm making. I certainly thought, as you did your presentation, I feel like I'm being put under somebody's control. I totally agree with you. Anyway, we have to stand up and stop this right now.
And one last comment or question at the back.
I kind of view Stephen Harper and his ilk as being like a juggernaut at this point in Canadian history. And with all my might, I want to stop them. But I'm wondering if what's currently a parental benefit, if the agenda of the ultras is to make the income splitting available to all couples. Like Andrew Coyne was musing about that.
Right. Well, the game plan here is to implement, I'm taking that what you said was a comment, so I'm not. Yeah. But no, the game plan has been very, very clear from day one. Start really, really small. Pension income splitting was popped out of the hat on Halloween 2006, right? Nobody knew it was coming. It's massively unfair, and it does all the same things that we've been talking about to women who are sort of on the cusp of deciding to retire, and the pressure is to retire to get out of paid work, et cetera, and same old story. The next thing that was proposed was a disability income splitting credit, except that nobody could figure out how to sell that because you had to really look quite far in the family for somebody to split the income with. So that never got enacted. Then there was a $168 discrepancy found in the after-tax treatment of the universal child care benefit, so-called. $100 a month going to buy you child care. And so a bill was quietly passed allowing the single parent to split that $168 difference yielding amount of the UCCB with their child, right? Then this parental income splitting was put in. It has been hammered by every expert in the country who's looked at it. And so now it has morphed over into the parental income splitting, but make absolutely no bones about it. This is designed to create a situation in which people like Jack Mintz, who is the architect of this particular line of discourse, who worked with the Institute for Marriage and the Family Canada to produce the one 3-page document that then led the government to say, yes, there's a lot of support for and good reason to do this. He said, well, so many people will be able to split income, it will discriminate against those who can't, so we have to give it to everybody. And when we do that, we're in the position in the United States where gender inequality is at an even greater risk than it is in Canada, because women in the United States since the end of World War II have lived with full income splitting, and believe me when I say it has stopped millions of women from earning their full potential, because they're always looking over their shoulder at the tax implications of that. Whether it be in a family business, oh no, honey, I won't take a salary, it'll show up on our tax return, or going into paid work, etc., or officially reported work or benefited work. It's a totally toxic tax measure, and it is the plan for Canada.
Oh, well, thank you again for your thought-provoking and anger-provoking talk.